And now for our presenter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here, and I'm very honored to have this opportunity to talk with you. And I commend you for taking the time to wrestle with some of the issues that I think I will perhaps present to you today. As you can see from this slide, I have a couple of different roles, one at the University of Vermont and one with the College Autism Network. But what might be more useful for you to know about this topic is that I've had about 30 years of experience on college campuses working in student affairs, in student activities, residence life, as a dean of students and as a vice president for student affairs. And it's really from that perspective that I approach this work. It's someone who has been on the receiving end of the decisions that families and students make to attend an institution that I work at, and trying to figure out how best to serve those students. And what has occurred to me over the years is the importance of doing what I call going upstream earlier than the arrival on campus to the time when families and students are talking about going to college and what that might look like. So my plan for these next about 45 minutes is to share with you some basic content about the college application process, to share some specific information that might be useful and interesting to you about colleges and universities, again, from the perspective of someone who has worked on them for a very long time. And then some suggestions that I hope will be helpful as you are considering going to college, considering sending a student to college, whether that's your son or daughter or a student that you're working with. So let me start with this process of applying to college. And my caveat here is that I have a whole lot of respect for the people who do the very difficult work of college admissions. It is tough, kind of grinding work, and they do it every year and deliver that class and then go back and start all over again. And the admission staff of any institution are a little like the salespeople at a car dealership. Some are very honest and very knowledgeable. Some are less so. But what I want you to know is that just like if you go to a car dealership, you can find a wonderful car working with either type of salesperson, but it requires you to be a pretty savvy and educated consumer, and that's what I'm hoping you'll leave this webinar with. The job of an admission staff is to bring in the class. That's what they are paid to do, to deliver a class at a particular size for that institution, and that institution's budget is based on that class size, and so every student counts. So this has several parts, and it means getting applications, choosing the students to admit, and then, of course, students accepting the offer. And the admissions folks are vitally concerned about each of those three steps. And for any institution, more applications are always better than fewer applications. So it's in an institution's best interest to get as many people to apply to their institution as they can, because that means that in order to fill the class, they can have a lower acceptance rate, and a lower acceptance rate, selectivity, is always better than a higher rate. And part of that, a big part of that, is because that is a critical figure in the equation that allows a school to be ranked in a certain place. So if they are very selective or highly selective, they are going to be ranked higher. That gets them more applications and allows them to actually increase their selectivity. And despite what anyone tells you about the admissions process, there is a certain randomness to the process. A student who's admitted one year might not have gotten admitted the year before or the year after. Building that class is a matter of putting together a lot of different pieces, and those pieces are different every year. And sometimes some really wonderful students are overlooked, and sometimes some not so wonderful students get in. So For the most part, the college knows what they're looking for and goes after those students, but there are always going to be some students around the margins who are left off or accepted. And the other thing that I want you to know is that information shared between families and institutions sometimes has gaps. So it's not, we don't always know what families are thinking, and families don't always know what institutions are thinking. And here are some relevant things that often are not shared. Colleges often do not share with families that there are limitations to services for students with special needs. And this isn't necessarily because they're trying to keep information from you. It's just that the admissions staff are not always aware at the level of granular detail about the services that might be available or not available for a student. They are unlikely to talk to you at visitation days and during other admissions activities about the lack of supervision on campus. So they will actually talk about the opposite, how many staff members there are, how many faculty there are, the low faculty to student ratio. And I'll get back to that in a minute. And colleges often leave out this pretty vital information, which is the role of students themselves in staying safe and successful. What a college will share instead is all the ways in which they help a student stay safe and successful. But students play a huge part in that part of their college experience. Going in the other direction, though, families, I have found, are not always completely forthcoming with colleges about things like learning differences and disabilities. And so often that information gets shared well into a student's enrollment, or even just before enrollment, instead of during the admissions process. And families often don't share concerns that they have about a student's mental or emotional health and their readiness for going to college, especially if it's a residential college where they're going to be living there. So why is that? It's because both colleges and families want the other to believe the absolute best about them. And so in this way, at this point, my analogy about the car buying kind of breaks down, because it isn't quite like buying a car. It's more like two businesses that are about to merge, and there's a lot of thought going into how much we want to share with this other business if we want them to acquire us or we want to be acquired by them. So these are some things to know that I think are really helpful, and some things to do. The first thing, and I think one of the most significant things, is that colleges are not like high schools when it comes to supporting students. I know a lot of families out there who have been fierce and effective advocates for their students who have learning differences, are very knowledgeable about what a school system is expected to do, is required by law to do. And I've met some of those parents in the college setting and have realized that they have expectations that match up more with what they've experienced in the K-12 world than with anything that post-secondary educators provide. And the reason for this is that there are different federal laws that dictate how K-12 and institutions of higher education must act. Two different sets of laws. So K-12 or pre-K-12 is overseen by the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so that's the federal legislation that tells schools what they are obliged to provide. Higher education doesn't have anything to do with the IDEA. They actually are overseen by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you think, well, that's great. There's still federal legislation dictating what institutions are supposed to do, but but these are very different philosophically. For instance, there's no IEP, individualized educational plan, at the college level, but that's a mainstay of pre-K-12. There is this different philosophy that I'll explain in a moment, and just simply fewer accommodations offered to students in the college setting. And this is a chart put together by Jane Thierfield Brown at the College Autism Spectrum that I think is really helpful, and it just compares side by side the IDEA and the ADA. So responsibility in the pre-K-12 world rests with the parent and the school. So oversight and implementation of any kinds of accommodations are the responsibility of the parent and the school together, whereas the ADA, the expectation is placed on the student to advocate for himself or herself or themselves, to seek accommodations. The IDEA's focus is to ensure success, whereas with the ADA, it's about access, and a student must be otherwise qualified to be successful at the institution in order to legitimately get access to the institution. So the IDEA is really focused on this idea of free access to a public education, but there's no equivalent of that in the ADA. Students are not guaranteed access to a free and public education in college. So the services that IDEA oversees are things like the evaluation, remediation, and all sorts of special accommodations, and sometimes a tremendous amount of accommodations to help a student be successful. The ADA, its language is all about reasonable accommodations, and that determination is actually made by the institution, not by the federal legislation. But all that said, what I want to say is most colleges, and I want to emphasize that I'm saying most, not all, because I don't know them all, but most colleges will not discriminate against a student with a learning difference or mental or emotional health challenge, right? Because that's against the law. That would violate ADA if they discriminated against that student. However, those that discriminate, and I put this in quotes because it's not, I want to make this distinction between sort of official obvious discrimination and what I think of as kind of an inherent systemic or cultural bias that an institution might have. And there are some institutions that might have a bias or consider an applicant's mental health or learning disabilities. And they're not supposed to do that. They're not really allowed to do it, but I couldn't tell you for sure that no schools ever do it. However, what I will say is that if you have a sense that there's a school that does have that inherent bias, it might not be the best school for that student to attend if they want to be successful, because then you're really kind of fighting this uphill battle from day one. And I'm not a proponent of them having that bias at all. I just know that it exists. Also, most colleges require disclosure of a diagnosis to make any accommodations. So, and that diagnosis disclosure is going to have to be a lot of documentation. They won't just take a student's word for it. So families need to be prepared to provide supporting documentation if they want any kind of accommodations. Most colleges will provide accommodations, again, with limitations. They are not required to provide things like personal care attendants or, one-on-one note takers or tutors. Things that they will provide are extended time for tests, note takers that are available to all students, and some limited opportunity to miss class when necessary. There are accommodations made. It's just not going to be as extensive. Some other important things that I think are really worth considering as you are thinking about sending a student to college, your own or a student you're working with. Again, most colleges, not all, but most colleges are, for the most part, unsupervised environments. Okay, they have staff to support students in the residence halls, but students have more freedom than most of them have ever had before. And I really want to emphasize this because I know that in the admissions process, the admissions staff are likely to talk about the professional staff who work in the residence halls and how, we have counselors and advisors available to students. And so they'll emphasize all of the ways in which students are supported by staff. But I can tell you, as someone who has been a hall director, who has supervised hall directors, who has helped to build residence halls and figured out how we were going to staff those, students have a lot of freedom. And if they don't want to be supervised, they won't be. They will be able to move with impunity around campus. And that's surprising for some families that think, especially if they're sending them to a small school, that they're going to get the kind of attention that they got in high school. They're not. The second thing is that most colleges have alcohol and other illegal substances within easy reach of students. And again, they might tell you that they've got wellness halls, and they might tell you that they, don't have an alcohol problem. But you've got to remember that they are trying to sell the institution and get those applications and get those students to apply. And if those students are admitted, to get those students to come. But I can tell you that with a few exceptions out there, if a student wants to drink, if a student wants to experiment with illegal substances, if a student wants to share their own medication with friends, it's very possible to do that. And because of that first bullet, the unsupervised environments, that can go on without staff knowing about it. And the truth is that most colleges may not know that something's going wrong until the student is in a serious hole, academically or conduct-wise. So for me, as a dean of students at a large university and at a small college, this was consistent. It would be around October, midterms, when a student would, somehow it would come out, whether they admitted it to their parents or to another faculty member, that they hadn't been going to class, or they were really struggling, they hadn't turned in work. And the parent will make the call in October to the dean, who seemed really nice during the admissions process. And we are really nice, but it's hard to keep track of our students. And the parent might say, well, I don't understand how this could happen. He hasn't been going to class for 3 weeks, and nobody seems to know that. Well, right, because we might have 1,500 or 15,000 students that we're trying to keep track of. And so at this point, a student might be in a serious hole, and it might be too late to kind of salvage the semester. Now, getting back to this difference between K-12 and higher education, in addition to the IDEA versus ADA thing, I just want to talk about confidentiality, because that's obviously a really critical point when we're talking about letting people know that a student's in trouble. So colleges assume that students are adults, and they may not always share information with parents. And that's actually another piece of federal legislation called FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. And what FERPA says is students are adults, and the college cannot share information. It can't share educational records with anyone. So grades, conduct issues, unless a student signs a waiver. And this is really hard for some parents to realize, that if a student makes a choice not to let their school share information, like their grades, the school is legally obligated to honor that request. And so I really encourage a conversation between students and parents about this ahead of time. If parents are paying the bills, they probably have a right to know that you're going to class and passing your classes. Not all students agree with that. Most colleges, however, will provide a waiver and make it really, really easy for students to sign that waiver and allow colleges to talk to parents and share grades. However, a FERPA waiver does not cover counseling and health providers on a college campus. They have a whole different set of expectations around confidentiality, and they are very strict about sharing information. And that's because their license depends on them not violating their ethical rules. And so you may have a student who signs a FERPA waiver, but if a parent wants to talk to the counselor they're seeing, that's a whole other waiver that the student's going to have to sign. So colleges, as I said, are not allowed to share this information without the waiver. And it doesn't matter if parents are paying the bills. And I've had this conversation so many times with parents. You know, I know they're the ones who are writing the check. And I'm legally not obligated to share. I'm legally obligated not to share that information. So I do want to make clear, though, that college administrators always have an out with this when they believe that a student is putting himself or herself or themselves at risk. And in fact, the New York Times had an article just this weekend about colleges' legal obligations around suicidal students. And FERPA is very clear. There is what they call a health and safety exception, that if an institution feels that a student is at risk of harming themselves or harming someone else, they are very much allowed to and encouraged to call families. And I've done that on a number of occasions myself. And I would have a lot of latitude. A dean has a lot of latitude about that distinction about what a student is doing to put himself or herself at risk. And honestly, I would rather have the argument with a student that I've revealed too much information than the argument with a parent that I didn't tell them when a student was really in bad shape. So hopefully I haven't freaked out too many people who are listening to this, because I know I'm talking about some really difficult and sensitive issues. But let me switch topics a bit here to making the college choice, which is a wonderful and crazy and exciting and terrifying process in the life of any family. And what I'll tell you is that some colleges are particularly good at serving students with learning differences. And some colleges are better than others at supporting students with mental and emotional health challenges. They just have figured out, they've got the right people and processes in place. And similarly, some colleges have programs for students with learning differences or conditions like autism. But many colleges will charge for those services, and financial aid doesn't necessarily cover those costs. So for example, I work with students on the autism spectrum, and I'm pretty familiar with a number of good programs across the country that recruit students on the spectrum and have this program that's got a lot of one-on-one time, a lot of social pragmatics instruction, but it might cost a family an additional $3,000 or $5,000 or even $10,000 a semester, depending on the level of services. And that's not going to be included in the financial aid package that a family receives. That's going to be on top of whatever other costs they're paying. So what colleges provide without those additional costs are a disability services office or an access office, and that's a legal requirement that an institution has this person who is responsible for this. And this office is the office that oversees all accommodations. Now, this office might be one person or it might be 40 people, depending on the size of the school and the commitment of resources that the institution has made. But there is this office. And this is the office through which all students must go in order to receive accommodations. They can't just go individually to faculty and get an accommodation. Faculty are trained to refer everything back to the Disability Services Office. Institutions also generally offer counseling and health services, and they're usually free, but that's actually changing each year. More and more schools are starting to bill in students' insurance for counseling sessions. Not a lot right now, but that number is just going to keep growing. So counseling sessions are free, but there might be limitations, like session limits, like you get the first 8 free. Or there might be some limited lab services, or they might charge insurance for certain services. And I can almost guarantee that if you raise your hand at a visitation day, like an admissions day, and ask, the admissions staff will not know this, or they won't know these details. So the admissions staff will say, we have a counseling center, and it's available to students free of charge. And that's really all the detail that they know. And so it's not until you kind of start to drill in and talk with the director of counseling that you find out that there are these limitations. Some colleges provide medication providers. They might have a psychiatrist who comes in, or a nurse practitioner who comes in like one day or half a day a week and meets with students. But it's often pretty limited, and insurance may cover that. It may be that a student can't get their medication unless they're also engaged with the counseling center. So there are some really important things that I think families need to do as they are preparing to look at colleges, to think about a student going to college. And the first is to have honest conversations with the admissions staff about what you think will be needed for a student to be successful. And I know that's hard because you might not want to reveal a whole lot of personal information about yourself, about your student. But the admissions staff wants students who are a good fit. And if they don't have the information and you ask very specific questions, they will try to get that information for you. You can always ask the admissions staff to refer you to the appropriate staff person on campus, and that might be the director of counseling, or the director of health services, or the director of disability services. And usually that admissions staff person is going to be pretty happy to make that referral because they've realized that they're at the limit of what they know about those services. And then I think you've got to follow up and have a thorough conversation with the appropriate staff person or office before a deposit is paid. And I emphasize that because once a student is accepted and makes the decision to go to that school, and you pay that deposit and they buy the sweatshirt and the parent gets the sticker for the car, if you find out later down the road that maybe this isn't the best fit or the best time, it's so hard to reverse course. So having these conversations before you go down that road is really very helpful. Also, some things that families can do at home before sending a student off to college. Make sure a student can manage his or her or their own medication. And by that I mean that they remember to take it reliably, they know when they're running out, they know how to get it refilled, they know not to share it with other people, and they understand how that medication might interact with alcohol or other recreational drugs that they might decide to use. I have said this to probably thousands of parents over the years. If you are the kind of parent who puts a student's medication, your child's medication, in front of them every morning at breakfast, and they take it and go off to school, you need to understand that in college they might not even eat breakfast. Right? They might sleep late because they don't have class until 2 in the afternoon. They don't eat meals on a regular schedule the way that they do at home. So if you've managed their medication and you send them off to college without those skills, this accounts for a lot of those October phone calls that a dean gets. And I've had so many conversations with students where I've tried to kind of peel the layers back to figure out what's been going on that has gotten them into such a hole. And I'll often find that a student has been on medication in the past, but either intentionally or just out of carelessness has stopped taking the medication. And it's right around October that that therapeutic level of medication is completely gone, and the student is really struggling. And they haven't necessarily tapered the way a physician might ask them to. And so, and at that point, it's really hard to just get them back on it, as you know, from just kind of building up a medication regimen. It can take weeks. If a student is currently seeing a counselor or another service provider, it's really important to begin discussing the transition to college right away. And one of those key things to discuss is, how will a student manage a crisis? Will they call their parents? Or, can they be counted on to make a call and ask for help if there's a crisis? Will they report concerns about themselves to a staff member? Will that provider that they've been seeing, that counselor they've been seeing, be available 24/7 in the event of a crisis? Because a lot of college counseling centers, they operate during business hours, but they don't necessarily have a 24/7 person available. And they might outsource that to a local emergency, a community mental health center, or 911. And so it might often not be the school's personnel dealing with a student at 2 a.m. If they need mental health services. So kind of having an understanding of how that will play out in a relationship that already exists is important. And then, I think related to that, consider maintaining an existing relationship with the provider and use the college's services for backup. So, often a student would show up the first week of classes at the counseling center and say, well, I understand I get free counseling and I'm here to sign up for that, and I need to see somebody twice a week because that's what I've been doing for the last 3 years. And no college counseling center is going to be able to accommodate that request. They just don't have the staff. The ratio of students to counselor that is required or suggested by their professional associations is like 1,500 students to one full-time counselor, which is not to say they're going to see 1,500, but the assumption is not all 1,500 students are going to need services. It's going to be a handful. Those students should be able to get the services. But the number of students requesting services every year increases as we see more students struggling with anxiety, mood disorder, and other emotional challenges. So maintaining a relationship between a current provider and the student is really a great idea if it's possible at all. And a lot of counselors are willing to do Skype sessions or phone sessions on a weekly basis, and insurance does cover those. And then the college counseling center can be there as a backup. I also strongly suggest to some families that they consider what I call a half-step year. And what I mean by this is that for a student to live at home while attending classes locally is a great way to try some things out, but with a safety net of the family that might keep a crisis from occurring or becoming really serious. And so if there is a local college where a student can even be like a non-degree student, community college, this gives a family a chance to let the student really try out taking responsibility for getting themselves up, getting their medication, getting their work done, getting to class on time. So students can take a couple of classes and maybe they can even get a part-time job, and this allows them to practice independent living skills, things like getting up and out the door on time without help from mom or dad, interacting with unfamiliar people, because that's, there's a lot of that in college, and advocating for oneself managing money. And then it also gives students a chance to take over full management of their health, their medication, their counseling appointments, and demonstrate competence in these areas, which are just so crucial to them being successful in college. And then after a semester or a year of this, that student is going to be so much more capable of succeeding in a residential college setting. Similar to a half-step year, though it doesn't involve college, is the gap year, which is an increasingly common approach. And this is where a student graduates from high school, and instead of starting college a mere 3 months later, and 3 months in which a student doesn't instantly become mature, because they've got a lot of other things to do that summer. A student might choose to work, live at home and work, volunteer. Maybe they travel. There are a lot of interesting programs out there, a lot of services. If you Google gap year, you'll find dozens and dozens of organizations that work with students and families, and some of them charge, and some of them are nonprofit and they don't charge. But there are a lot of really creative ways that a student can spend a year ahead of going to college. And what we know very, very clearly from the research is that students who take a gap year tend to do better in their first year in college. And it's not surprising at all, right? Because they've got a year of maturity and growth and independence under their belt. And, if they've just been living at home and working, they've maybe saved some money. They haven't had to pay a huge tuition bill or take out a very large loan. Because a student who goes to college and they're not ready to be there takes on a significant cost, okay? And the first is academic struggles. It's a really different world than anything they've experienced in high school. And the level of autonomy and independence, self-sustenance that they need to have in college classes is profoundly different than what they've had in high school. There are these increased social risks. Students who perhaps have never had the opportunity to be unsupervised before decide that it would be really totally cool to get drunk on a regular basis, and that kind of behavior might lead them to end up getting in trouble, getting suspended, as well as not doing very well academically. And there's the emotional overwhelm. Every year we see more students with a diagnosis of anxiety disorder coming to college. And even for students who don't struggle with anxiety, college is anxiety producing, right? It's a new environment, it's new people. There's what we call in my work the hidden curriculum of all of the things that everybody else seems to know but you don't. And it can just be overwhelming. And I've seen so many students just really struggle under the weight of their own fear and concern, even when they are really pretty well put together. I don't know that any student comes in and just completely crushes everything. Like they really do have things that overwhelm them. And the other is the cost of not being ready is financial loss. And that is, that's really pretty significant. When a student leaves college prematurely, so whether they've been there for a few weeks and have decided they're not ready, or halfway through the semester, or they leave at the end of one semester and don't have it in them to go back for the second semester, whether it's their decision or the college's, the financial cost is really significant. Loans that a family has taken out must be repaid even if a student doesn't complete a semester. right? So if a family's borrowed, it's gotten a parent loan, a plus loan for like $5,000 for this to pay for the semester, and the student drops out in October or November, or the end of the semester withdraws because they're not going to pass any classes, you still have to pay that repay that loan. And so the lenders don't care that the student hasn't completed a semester or doesn't have a credit to show for it. Tuition and room and board are not usually refunded, or if they are, it's kind of on a prorated basis. So it might be that, after this date, we will give you 50% of your housing back, but after this date, none. And same with dining. And one thing that I'll mention here is that some schools do offer tuition refund insurance, and that's a really good question to ask, because if a school offers that, and when they offer it, what I mean is like they contract that to somebody. They have a provider that they recommend, an independent provider. And tuition refund insurance is a really, really good idea. And I have seen that be the case for so many families. And I'm committed to always advocating that they get this. And it might cost, $200 or $300 or $400 for a year. But if a student has to drop out because they have some emotional or mental health challenges, or they just, break their leg, playing rugby, tuition refund insurance will refund 100% of the insurance of the tuition bill. And that can make a big difference for a family that's trying to decide whether or not a student should withdraw. You never want money to be the reason that a student stays enrolled when it might not be in his or her or their best interest. And the emotional cost is even more significant. For a student who leaves college prematurely, a student has to explain to friends and family and teachers and neighbors why they're not at college, and it's hard for parents too. And it's very sad for a student to feel like they have failed, and it can cause them to lose confidence in themselves and struggle to return or even to go to a new institution. They've lost faith that they can do it, and getting them back on track is really pretty tough. And so if any of the things that I have presented here can help a student make a really informed decision as an educated and savvy consumer, I hope that's the case. But I also want to say this, that things can work out just fine. And in fact, that happens more often than not. College is a time of growth and challenge for all students and all families, and a lot of them get through those challenges and students succeed. And at this time of year, there are so many students walking across the stage getting a diploma who had a pretty shaky start. And I want you to know too that most people who work in higher education care a lot about students' success, and they're not there to thwart that success or make you crazy or frustrate anybody. They really want students to succeed. And lastly, I'll just say that everyone's experience is and should be different. And I don't have a script here for how everything is going to go for a student who's got learning differences or emotional or mental health challenges. These are some of the patterns that I've seen, but I also am regularly surprised by students who go off script, and things do work out just fine. And so with that, I'll just give you my contact information. And I've got a few questions that have come in that I want to address. So how much should a student talk about their learning challenge in their college essay? Yeah, it's a great question. I think, if it's been a really formative experience for a student to have that learning difference and how they've come to manage it, I think it's a great topic. Again, it's not going to deter a college from accepting a talented student who seems like a good fit for the institution. It might raise a flag, and they might say, we definitely want you to talk to our disability folks, but gosh, what a great essay. But one of the things that I always say to college administrators about students on the spectrum, because those are the ones I work with most, is they have had to overcome so many challenges to get where they are that they are absolutely the students you want enrolled on your campus. Another question, my son has a learning challenge, who has learning challenges, had an IEP in high school, doesn't think he'll need any support in college. What should I do as his mom? Yeah, if he doesn't think that's the case, that's tough. You can, if you have any access to students who have gone to college, whether they have learning differences or not, they might be more likely to get through to him about just how hard it is and how different it is. And so maybe you can divert the conversation from you so it's not a power struggle with your son to just some really cool peers who kind of know what the score is and would say, dude, if I could have gotten help, I definitely would have done that. Or, my access counselor was the most important person for me. My daughter's high school IEP team and teacher do so much for her that she's not learning to do things for herself. What should I do? I think that's where that half-step year or gap year can be really helpful, because, the phrase we use all the time working with students in college disabilities is the service cliff. It feels like that. The level of service just falls off drastically, and that student's on the cliff and they go plummeting, and then we're trying to pick them up and put them back together. Having that kind of support for a year without the pressure of a full course load is a great way for students to practice some of those skills. Do you find a high success of students who have taken AP or IB classes since they are used to taking more intense classes in high school? Yes and no. So schools that have a really robust AP or IB curriculum also have a lot more services, tend to have smaller classes, and those all work to a student's benefit in terms of support. And then they go to college and that level of support and engagement isn't there. So they might actually stumble a bit, even though academically they've done the work. Succeeding in college is not just about understanding the academic content. It's about understanding the process and the independent ability that's required to follow that process. So, I've seen some students come in who've not had any AP or IB experience, and they do fine because they've got good independent learning skills. My understanding is that students in Vermont can take college classes while they're still in high school through Vermont's Flexible Pathways law. What are your thoughts on this opportunity? Amazing opportunity for students to get a sense of how different a college class is than a high school class. It could backfire if they end up in a class that is not particularly rigorous, and that can happen because at any college, no matter how elite it might be, there are some classes that are easier than others. But a carefully chosen class that really does challenge them, again, on both the content and the process of learning, is a really great way for them to test out some of their own assumptions about just how smart they are. Sometimes students want to switch colleges after a semester or two. Is there insurance a family can purchase to ensure that credits are transferable? I've never heard of that, but I do know that a lot of schools, students should never be hindered from transferring because credits don't transfer. There are some institutions out there that have pretty funky curricula, but as a quick example, I'll tell you that my partner is an academic dean at Champlain College, and they have a very unusual curriculum, and a whole lot of her time is spent working with students and to make sure that those students are transferring, that they get credit for all of the courses that they've taken, and she has to write a lot of letters that explain the Champlain curriculum. But if a student needs to transfer, they need to transfer. It's just sometimes going to be the best thing. So asking ahead of time is usually the best strategy. Do any colleges have online systems for students and parents? If student gives permission, that will show grades, attendance, assignments, etc. Yes, definitely on grades. Most grading is done in a learning management system that the college has, might be called Banner or Blackboard, and students can give their parents the password that gives them the access to the grades. Things like attendance and assignments are going to be individual to the professor, and some of them use those learning management systems really heavily. And so if a parent has the Blackboard or the Moodle password, yeah, they can see that a student has submitted work or not submitted it. But some professors don't use a lot of that, a lot of the online technology. So it's going to be pretty individual. But grades, definitely, the registrar's records will all be online. Do college admissions departments make exceptions on standardized tests, essays, or other admissions requirements? Yeah, some of them do. Some schools are test optional, and so they don't even consider a student's SAT or ACT score. But that's a good set of questions to ask as you're considering looking at that school. I'd be happy to talk with you about some specific questions that you have in reference to this question. Yeah, please do send me an email. We can have a phone conversation. And you'd like me to come and talk with my daughter's high school counseling department, or maybe to families who attend the college transition event held at the high school. I am definitely available to do this. This is a real passion for me. I really want students to be successful in anything that I can do to help that process and help my colleagues out there on campus get the right students on their campus prepared and really ready to be successful. I'm happy to do. Would you recommend any books that families can refer to that compare access services at different colleges? Oh, I don't know any books, but I will say that most colleges have their disability services folks have some sort of an online presence, and you'll be able to tell something about them just by looking at what they've got in terms of staff and programs. So I really encourage you to do that kind of research. Thank you. Great info, very well organized. Oh, well, great. I'm so glad you. Thank you, Christine, for that. And I'm going to sign off and turn this back to Janice. So please do feel free to be in touch.
So thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Please visit our website at vermontfamilynetwork.org for lots of helpful resources, upcoming webinars, workshops, and other events. We're going to save this webinar on our website along with a copy of the PowerPoint, and we're also going to put it on our YouTube channel. If you would like to talk with someone here at VFN, we encourage you to give us a call at 1-800-800-4005. And have a great day. Thank you.
Real quick,